Hello. Welcome to the next in the series of review clips designed to assist you in preparing for your Biology 3201 public examination. In this clip, we'll be taking a look at various mechanisms of evolution, taking a look at how it is that species have evolved to create very broad ranges of traits, characters, and the like. This picture you see in front of you of a male peacock clearly demonstrates that evolution can indeed result in significant changes to populations of organisms. But we have to ask ourselves the question, how is it that this variation is firstly generated and subsequently maintained? One means is through what we term to be random genetic drift. Random genetic drift utilizes change as an evolutionary force. In short, random genetic drift is the random change in allele frequencies from one generation to the next that is caused by the finite size of the breeding population of parents. It occurs by chance. By chance, some parents with certain traits will have more offspring than others. By chance, some parents have fewer offspring or no offspring at all. And as traits get passed from parent to offspring, the chance of parents with one set of traits breeding in greater number than those with the opposite can change populations over time. Random genetic drift occurs in all countable finite populations. It has a bigger significance in small populations, being weaker in large ones. The strength of random genetic drift is proportional to the size of the population. On average, random genetic drift decreases genetic variation within populations. In other words, it makes populations genetically less variable and individuals more homozygous in small isolated areas. Yet, between populations, among populations, it increases the difference between them. Random genetic drift makes different populations genetically different from one another. By way of example, if we take a population which consists of, let's see in front of you, 5 red, 5 blue, 5 bluish, no chance events, the proportion would remain the same. Yet, just by chance, if the red ones happen to breed in larger numbers than the blue ones, the population would change, becoming more red and less blue. Just by chance, different things can happen. A different set of outcomes with a different set of random chances. If the blue ones reproduced in greater numbers, just by chance, this would change the population. Again, with a small population size of 15, this would be a much more significant factor. If by happenstance these reproduce in greater numbers, again, a different set of circumstances based entirely on chance. In short, from one common starting point, many different chance events can lead to many different possible outcomes based on just completely random circumstances. Remember, it increases variation among populations. If you start with a bunch of isolated populations, each of which the same original genetic distributions, with a few generations of random assortment, random genetic drift, you get a lot of different populations. Each individual becomes more and more dissimilar over time. Yet, over time, within each population, they become more and more similar. Mostly red, mostly blue, etc., 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 etc. From all the populations that were originally genetically different, they become genetically different to each other, but more homogeneous within their boundaries. Now, migration opposes random genetic drift. It mitigates the impact of isolated gene pools. If the populations are mixing with migration, the difference between them become mitigated because that gene was continually being reinfused back in with migration. So over time, with population where there's a lot of gene flow, the average chance of genetic drift mitigates itself out. So the average chance of many events over time would render the population unchanged if there was significant gene flow. In short, to summarize, random genetic drift, on average within population, it decreases genetic variation. It makes individuals more homozygous, more genetically similar. Populations become genetically less variable, and it causes fixation or loss of alleles. It diminishes the heritable variation for natural selection. Yet, among populations, it increases genetic variation. It makes different populations genetically more different from one another. And third, genetic fixity of species isn't possible. There is continual change of finite populations by chance, random genetic drift. Populations are continually changing by that feature alone. So there are ecological impacts for random genetic drift. Firstly, continuous drift. It's often the most important factor contributing to evolutionary change in populations that are always small. Endangered species, island populations, those populations with a skewed mating system where there's many individuals but few that actually breed. We have intermittent drift when you have large fluctuation in population size. If the population is reduced to a very small numbers near extinction, for example, the northern elephant seals, cheetahs, and the like. With colonization, the founder effect. Here, a small group of individuals become geographically isolated from the remainder of the species, and this small group colonizes a new site. A prime example of the bottleneck effect will be the Florida Panther. In 1500, its range extended all across the southwestern United States, all the way to Texas. In 2001, the population was isolated to a small portion of the geography in Florida, which you see illustrated here in blue. As a result, this population was hunted to near extinction. About 50 years ago, there were very few left. In fact, in 2001, there were fewer than 60. There is very little genetic variation in the species as a result. More homogeneous, but more different than other populations. There is a lower variation than other panther species. And in fact, there was a lower variation than was in museum samples of 1900. The problem was that they started showing symptomatics of inbreeding. 80% of the males had low sperm counts. 93% had a normal sperm. This impact on the ability for the males to reproduce. There was a high frequency of kinked tail in the sperm, this being a recessive trait. To save the species, outbreeding was conducted, where individuals from a Texas subspecies were brought in to expand the gene pool. Natural selection, which we've discussed quite frequently, is another means by which populations can change. If you look at a population where you have white and dark shaped bugs, those that are light, just as with the peppered moth, are at a disadvantage on a dark background and they get eaten. This is natural selection. The environment putting one variance at a disadvantage, less likely to reproduce, less likely to pass on the traits, and over time the population should move towards the opposite trait, the one that is better suited for the environment. Now, we cannot assume that natural selection will always lead a population to achieve an optimal level of adaptation. Mutations, another source of variety, will introduce harmful alleles, and they can become fixed by random genetic drift. Natural selection cannot and will not produce the best of all possible worlds. Selection occurs on a number of different means. Firstly, directional selection. Here in directional selection, the population is moving towards the extreme. In the case of giraffes, for example, a long neck was advantageous for the species, so the population moved towards long necks. Stabilizing selection is where the intermediate form is at an advantage, and the population moves towards higher numbers in the medium or intermediate range of the trait. Stabilizing selection, another type of natural selection, is selection against the extremes and in favor of the intermediate. Try and illustrate. If we start out with a population of flowers, blue, violet, and red, and we apply stabilizing selection to it, the end result will be blue is at a disadvantage, red is at a disadvantage, so the population becomes primarily violet. This is stabilizing selection. Directional selection is selection for an extreme or rare phenotype. The population shifts in one direction. Again, looking at our example of flowers, blue, violet, and red, if blue flowers were at a disadvantage and for some reason didn't attract pollinators, the population would shift in this direction in terms of percentages. The population would eventually become primarily violet and red, again, shifting towards one of the extremes. That's directional selection. Disruptive selection is selection against the intermediate, but not against the extremes. The intermediate phenotype is at a disadvantage. Again, taking our same example of flowers, if the violet or intermediate phenotype was at a disadvantage, it would not be passed on as greater numbers. Those individuals possessing violet would not reproduce in as large a set of numbers. Blue and red are at an advantage in this environment. The end result would be that the population becomes blue or red. This is disruption selection. So to summarize, if we have an original population of mice which range from light to dark, directional selection would move the population towards primarily dark. Diversifying selection, either very light or very dark, and stabilizing the medium phenotype. But there are some specific types of selection within natural selection. One of these is ecological selection, which is selection for enhanced survival in a given environment. This is our traditional means of natural selection, what best suits the environment. And we also have sexual selection, where enhanced mating success is based on variation in secondary sex characteristics. In many cases, males and females differ not only in reproductive organs, but also in the traits that are related to becoming mates or acquire mates. These differences are usually referred to as sexual dimorphism. For example, if you take the quail, the female versus the male is very different from the female in coloration. In fact, that is typical in the bird species, all bird species, that males tend to be more brightly colored. The male is colored this way because it is through this coloration that he is able to attract a mate. Females are more attracted to brightly colored males. So in viewing the male's attributes, the female is more likely to mate with and choose him as a mate. In salmon, the same thing. You can clearly see the difference in physical patterns. The hooked jaw, body depth. Female salmon, you can see her body shape versus the male salmon and his body shape. very clearly distinguishable. This is a classic case of sexual dimorphism. Again, the female sees these traits and she is more likely to deposit her eggs in the nest that this male has made. It is the depth of the back that is that attractive feature. Sexual selection can involve either female choice, where the female chooses the male, or male-to-male competition. Bull moose, male lions, they compete for resources, they compete for territories. Whoever wins the territory mates with the females contained within it. Now, based on sexual selection, we can make a prediction as to what would happen to the male body depth. Over time, with sexual selection, with males that have deep bodies, reproduce in greater numbers, we would expect that over time the male will become taller. Sexual selection favors an increased depth of the body. Sexual selection would lead the population to move towards a deeper bodied population. Sexual selection gradually increases the body depth. Now, this would generate a problem as salmon swim. As they swim, water flows against them. The deeper the back, the more water resistance they will encounter. Which male is going to be more successful at swimming upstream of the two you see pictured? The answer would be the smaller one. It has less water resistance. This would represent ecological selection. So the quandary is that sexual selection favors an increase in body depth, whereas ecological selection favors a decreased body depth. The two interplay to create a balance between the two. There's an interplay between ecological selection and sexual selection in salmon. And for this reason, organisms aren't perfect. They are locked into historical constraints, and adaptations are often compromised the balance between ecological and sexual selection. Evolution is not always adaptive. Genetic drift, reduction in gene flow, and the like contribute. And remember, selection only acts and edits variation that presently exists in the population. In past public examinations, sample questions have been posed from this material. This question was posed, asked to describe the condition when alleles move between local populations due to migration and subsequent interbreeding. This would be B, gene flow. Another question in this material asked, on an island portion of Newfoundland and Labrador, we have an abnormally high rate of psoriasis. Why is that? The answer to this is B, founder effect. This question asks, which mechanism of evolution leads the population to evolve toward the extremes for a trait? Again, because you are asked for extremes, plural, this is both extremes. The answer to this question would be B, disruptive selection. If it was extreme, singular, that would be directional. If it was towards against the extremes, that would be stabilizing. And this question is posed, a population of 1,000 birds lives on an island. Some of the birds are green and some are yellow. Yellow, however, is recessive. If a hurricane kills most of the birds, which condition will result if the 10 surviving birds are all yellow? This would be a reduction based on mass extinction, near extinction events, or the bottleneck effect be? Thank you for your attention. I hope you found this learning clip to be helpful.